God willing, today we are on chapter 31 of the book of Shmuel, Shmuel Aleph. This is the final chapter of Shmuel Aleph. It's quite clear that the splitting of Shmuel into two books, as we've said before, that is not the Jewish custom. It was probably somewhere around the 1200s when they committed. I think the Christians broke it up into chapters and then verses. I think that's where the division started. But according to Chazal, we view Shmuel as one book. Probably why they cut it in half is because this is really the end of an era. As we're going to see tonight, chapter 31, the final chapter, deals with the death of Shaul. And from here on out, it's going to be the story of David. And it could be that's why they divided it like that. But either way, that's where we are tonight. So very briefly, where are we holding now? You recall that the Plishtim were gathering against the Jews for battle. Shaul went to consult with the Baalat Ov, with the witch, who brought back Shmuel, and Shmuel informed Shaul that tomorrow the Jews will lose the war, and you are going to die, and you'll be here with me. So Shaul knew that this is going to be his final day. Then the scene shifted to David. David, who was hiding with the Plishtim in the city of Tziklag, he very ironically is now asked to come to fight against the Jews. And by some hashgacha, the Plishtim didn't want him joining, so he ended up going back, where he discovered that the Amalekim had burned down his city and taken all their families captive. So David chased after the Amalekis, wiped them out except for 400 who escaped, and he was able to get back all of the captives and all of the stuff that they took. And now he even added on the Amalekis' spoils that he was able to keep, and they gave everything back to everyone. And that's where we went last time. Okay, so we kind of left the front lines of war to hear this side story about David fighting against Amalek and going back to his city in Ziklag. And now chapter 31 is going to take us back to the front lines of war against the Plishtim, where we've already been told the outcome is going to be the Jews will lose and Shaul will die. So let's get into that. It says in verse number 1, chapter 31, Uflishtim nilchamim beYisrael. The Plishtim were fighting against the Jews. Vayanusu anshe Yisrael mipnei Plishtim. And the Jews they fled. The Jews fled from the Plishtim. Vayplu chalalim behar haGilboa. And their bodies fell on Mount Gilboa. It's interesting. It says here that they fled, they ran away, and they fell. There is a speech that the Kohen Mashuach Melchama, that a special appointed officer, gives to the Jewish army before they go to war. In the Mishnah and Sota, it says the general ideas that he shares with them. And one of the things he tells them is, you're going to war now against your enemies, not against your brothers. They are not going to have any mercy. Don't fear. And the expression there is kitchilat nefilah nisa. I believe that's it. The beginning of your downfall will be your fleeing. If you have fear and you begin to run away, that's already the beginning of the end. And here you actually have that exact formula. It says vayanusu, that they ran away, vayplu, and then they fell. Right? When a person's in war, if it's a war that God allowed or even commanded, then you ought not fear. You should go in with confidence. Okay. But they fell. And now the Plishtim trapped Shaul and his sons. And they actually strike down very tragically. It says here 3 of the 4 sons of Shaul, Yehonatan, Avinadav, and Malkishua. He had another one called Ishboshet, who was not around. Either he fled or he didn't come in the first place. So it's an interesting thing. One of Shaul's sons was actually still alive. Now the war got even heavier, and the archers, Vayimtsa'u Hamorim Anashim Bakashet. The archers now detected Saul. The archers found him, Vayachel Me'od Mehamorim. And Shaul became very afraid of the archers. Now, the simple meaning is Shaul was afraid because he's going to get killed. Oh no, they got me, I'm going to die. But the truth is, Shaul already knew he was going to die. He knew that this was his final battle, so he had kind of come to terms with it. We have to appreciate that he walked into the battle, and even as the Jews were fleeing, he stayed there with his sons to continue fighting. Appreciate that here is the king who knew he was going to die and nevertheless walked in to protect his people. So this is actually quite a great thing we see about Shaul. So what does it mean that he was afraid of the archers? He knew he was going to die. So the Abarbanel explains he was afraid that they would just wound him and then take him and make a mockery out of him through the streets, and it would be a tremendous chil Hashem, desecration of Hashem's name. That's what he feared, not death. He didn't fear death because he knew it was happening. He had walked towards it. Vayomer Shaul, I don't know if anyone's out there. I just see names and the Wolpert's beautiful chandelier, but I hope you're all there. And if not, okay, very good. I hear you. Okay. Vayomer Shaul lenosei chelav. Shaul tells his arms bearer. Somebody ask a question?
Yeah, the son that was not there.
Yeah.
That's the one that was I guess I'll call it mentally disturbed or some kind of.
Ishboshet, was he mentally disturbed? Have we read about that? Not that I recall. I don't know much about him. The Radak says, where did it go? I don't know much about Ishboshet yet. I mean, there's the Gemaras about him, but I don't. Not that I know.
But there was earlier. I mean, I remember from studies with Rabbi Friedman when we covered this ground, we talked about this individual, and I thought there was something about that.
Interesting. Okay. That could very well be. I just don't know. Okay. So what's remarkable here is, you know, who else is omitted is Avner, the army general of Shaul. He wasn't around. Why wasn't he killed together with them? Apparently, he also ran away. It got really bad, right? They were completely retreating, and Shaul and his sons stayed to fight. At least most of his sons. Okay, so now the archers get him. He's afraid of the archers. So Shaul says, I can't be taken by them. He tells his armor bearer, take out your sword, Vidokreniva, and stab me with it, lest these uncircumcised people come and stab me and make sport out of me. But the arms bearer did not want to kill Shaul, even though the king had requested it. So Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. He was committing suicide. And the arms bearer sees that Shaul had died, so he also commits suicide. So and then verse 6 says, Shaul and three of his sons and his armor bearer and all of his men died on that day together. I have a tremendous defeat.
So
okay.
In verse 1, where it says, battling with Israel, and the men of Israel ran off, and they fell and were slain.
Yeah.
That's only the army of Saul?
Yes.
Not the people that were following David and such?
Correct. The people that were following David actually were not here. They had come to the front lines and they were sent back because they came to support the Plishtim, right? The Plishti leader thought he was on this side. So they're actually not in the scene right now.
Okay.
Which is significant. We'll see soon that this is an amazing transition. The rise of David is, you can imagine, is very elated. He's sitting there after just rescuing all of the captives of the Jews and got all their stuff and smashing Amalek. He's sitting there after tremendous ishgacha. He has no idea what's happening in the front lines. But you see the contrast that as one sector of the Jews are falling, Hashem makes sure that there's somebody who's successful that can lead us further, which is David. So here we have Shaul committing suicide. You likely know that it is forbidden to commit suicide. like we learned in the Parsha of Noach, it says you're allowed to eat animals, but your own blood I will hold you accountable for. One cannot wound himself. You can't even cause a physical wound to yourself if it's not for a productive purpose, like getting a vaccine shot or something. And you're certainly not allowed to commit suicide. And a person who commits suicide, if we know that he did it with a lucid mind, he is not accorded the regular honors of having eulogies and people sitting shiva for him. We don't rend our garments. Nowadays, practically speaking, and God forbid if there's a case of suicide, we assume that at the last minute he regretted it and something went wrong, or that he was under some influence and he was temporarily insane. And also for the honor of the living relatives, we will give them all the regular honors. But the pure halacha is if somebody with a lucid mind committed suicide, he's not accorded any honor. And in this case, how could you have the righteous king of Israel committing suicide? So this is discussed by several commentaries at length. Maybe notably as the Maharshal, Rav Shlomo Luria, 1400s. He writes that perhaps Shaul here he was a special exception to the rule. He knew that he was going to die. He had been told by the prophet Shmuel that he's going to die today. And as he says himself, it will be a tremendous desecration of Hashem's name if he gets caught alive. They'll torture him and make a mockery of him and the Jewish people and of God. And he's the king. So those three factors combined make this an exceptional case. It's going to be a tremendous desecration of Hashem's name and of the Jewish kingship. And he also knew that he was going to die. So he was killing a dead man, in other words. There's no chance that he would survive because it was already said that he would die today. There are cases, that being said, there are cases where we find Jews committing suicide to protect themselves or their children from being raised with idolatrous practices. For example, in the story of Chanukah, when the Greeks forbade Shabbos observance and circumcision, it's recorded in the Megillas Antiochus that a woman took her son up to the parapet, the top of the wall. She circumcised him or had him circumcised, and then she and her son jumped off, or she took her son and jumped off of the wall because she realized that they would catch her and raise her son like a non-Jew. So to protect him from such a future spiritual death, she gave him a physical death. And those are extreme cases, and it might be that in such a case, if you know for sure that the enemy is going to abduct this child and raise him living an anti-God life, it's possible that in such a case would be permitted. Okay, Hashem should never bring us to these practical situations. Okay, in any event, Shaul commits suicide, and so does his arms bearer. Now, the exceptions we said for Shaul do not apply to the arms bearer. He just committed suicide. He should not have done it. Okay, and they all die. Verse number 7, Vayiru anshe Yisrael asher be'ever ha'emek va'asher be'ever ha'yarden ki nasu anshe Yisrael. The Jews watching from afar saw that the armies had fled and that Shaul had died. So they retreated from their cities. So this was a great loss. The Plishtim entered, encroached into Jewish territory, and actually took over their cities. Everyone had just packed out and left. They evacuated. And it was the following day, and the Plishtim came onto the war site to strip the corpses, to take their treasure and their stuff. And lo and behold, who did they find? They find Saul and his 3 sons, the king himself, dead on the mountain of Gilboa, Behar HaGilboa. There's a grammatical thing here I'm just going to put in for the record. It's a super side point. It should say Behar Gilboa, Mount Gilboa. In Hebrew, for some reason, there's an extra hey over here, Ha Gilboa. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky suggests, based on this and other places where you have a similar phenomenon, for example, Ha-Yarden, the Jordan River, it should just refer to it as Yarden, that perhaps Gilboa is actually a noun. It just means like a certain type of hill. And Hageh, the Gilboa, refers to a particularly famous one. And in this case, Ha-Gilboa is known as the Gilboa because it's the one that Shaul died on. That's an interesting grammatical thing. if you find words like Hagilboa, Hamishor, it's referring to a distinct one, and that becomes Hagilboa but the word itself is a noun and not a proper noun. Okay, that's a super grammatical side point, and we're done with that. Okay, verse number 9. The Plishtim find Shaul, they sever his head, and they strip him of his royal garb. And what do they do? A complete disgrace. And they send around his body parts and his garments to tell their people that they've been victorious. They take the head of Shaul. Actually, in Divrei Hayamim, in the book of Chronicles, there are more specifics. They took his head and they hung it in the Beit Dagon, their idol, the fish god, Dagon. Remember, it's like half fish, half man. And they hung his head next to their idol, as if to say he conquered it. This might be extra symbolic for them, because you may recall they have a memory of the Ark of Hashem coming into the Beit Dagon, and the next morning their idol was beheaded, and his arms had fell off also and face down on the floor. So they go back into that temple where the Jewish God had beheaded their idol, and now they take the head of the king and they hang it next to their idol. So it's a tremendous Chilul Hashem, desecration of Hashem's name, and you kind of see the story coming together like that. His body they hung in the wall of Beit Shan in various locations amongst their territory. Who gets word of this? Yoshvei Yavesh Gilad. The inhabitants of Yavesh Gilad, they hear about what the Plishtim did to Saul. They see that his head is hanging in one place and his body in another place. And what do? They make a very brave rescue mission. By Akumukul Ish Chayil, the valiant ones amongst them got up, and they went all night. By Khuet Gviyat Shaul. And in the middle of the night, they're able to rescue the body of Shaul and the body of his sons from the walls of Beit Shan. And they come to Yavesh, and over there they burn them. And then they take the bones and they bury them in Yavesh, and they fast 7 days in mourning for this loss that they had incurred. So again, the Plishtim take the bodies of Shaul and his sons, they behead Shaul, they hang up their bodies and disgrace them in public. And then the residents, the Jewish inhabitants of Yavesh Gilad, they hear about it and they do a rescue operation to get back these bodies. It's very significant. Yavesh Gilad, you may recall, it's come up twice before. But right now, the significant one is in chapter 11, about 20 chapters ago, shortly after Shaul was anointed, before he was actually accepted as king on all the Jews, a Nachash, the enemy named Nachash, which means snake, he actually came directly to Yavesh Gilad and threatened the inhabitants. He said, you need to cut off your thumbs and if you want a treaty. And Shaul came, he amassed an army, and he rescued the residents of Yavesh Gilad. So you can understand that they had a sense of tremendous gratitude to him for having protected them. So here now at the end of his life, they do him this favor. After he's died, they do him this favor out of gratitude to rescue him and his sons. So again, you see that the theme is connected. It's not just an arbitrary people that heard about it. They specifically had a deep debt of gratitude. Furthermore, you may recall after the Pelegish Begiva, the concubine in Giva, it was forbidden to marry into the tribe of Benjamin. But in order to preserve that tribe, the men of Benjamin were instructed to take women from Yavesh Gilad. And so these inhabitants were actually related to Shaul through marriage. They were, they all had what to do with the tribe of Benjamin. So they, not only were they family, but they also had a personal debt of gratitude. And that's why they went to save him. Now it says, after they saved the bodies, in verse number 12, it says that they burned them. We don't do that. It's, cremation is a terrible thing, and awful if it happens to a body. We don't do that. So what does it mean that they burned to the bodies of Shaul and his brethren? So Rashi says, it said, he quotes the Targum, the Aramaic translation, uklu alehon, that they burned on them, which means they didn't burn the actual bodies, but what they did was they burned the stuff, the possessions of Shaul. Shaul was the king, and it is the custom, because of the honor of the king, nobody's allowed to use his stuff after he has. Nobody can even marry his wife after he divorces her. Once you've married the king, that's it. You belong to the king. Even the horses are hamstringed, and their possessions are burned in honor to say that nobody else could use this, only the king. And so that's what it means that they burned it. That's how Rashi learns. They didn't actually burn the bodies. That would be forbidden to desecrate a body, but they burned their stuff, the Shaul stuff, the royal things. However, I think it's the Radak that says that their bodies had begun to decay and develop a lot of filth, and therefore for an honor, in the sake of honoring the body and making it dignified, they actually burnt off all of the muck and whatever it had gathered and decomposing hanging out there by the Plishtim. So they burnt the flesh off, and then they buried the bones. Okay, this is a bit of a gruesome graphic detail, but it's worth mentioning because you can't just bury a body unless so here it either doesn't mean that or it was a restorative process rather than destructive. Did you have a question?
Could it also have been that they did not want future peoples to pillage the grave sites of Saul and his sons?
Interesting, like you have by the pharaohs in Egypt. You know, everyone's got a grave thief. That's interesting. Well, they would never bury the king. The truth is, in that period in history, maybe they did. That's an interesting point. Like the alternative, you're saying, let's bury them with their royal garments, but that would lead to a risk of having the graves defaced later when they're overturned.
Right.
That's interesting. I was going to say that they don't bury them with royal garments. Nowadays, perhaps you know that everyone's buried in simple shrouds, as if to equal. But then I realized that I didn't answer that because that was a later institution that happened towards the end of the Second Temple, when it became a bit of a competition, and it was embarrassing when somebody passed away. They didn't have wealth they left behind. They wouldn't have the fancy shrouds that everybody else had. So Rabban Gamliel instituted that everyone should get equal treatment, and we bury everyone with simple white shrouds. So that implies it could be that previously they would bury them with fancy things, but I don't know for sure if they would have. Good point. Okay, and so they take the bones and then they fast for 7 days in grieving the loss of Shaul. Okay, let's go a little further. We're going to have a second account of Shaul's death, and the question is how to put the two pieces together. Okay, so now we are beginning the book of Shmuel 2, which is really a continuation of the same story. So we're in chapter 1 now. It says, Vahi acharei mot Shaul. It was after the death of Shaul, v'David shav me'akot et Amalek. And David returns from striking the Amalekis, as we said, and he sits in his city of Tziklag for 2 days. Which we can imagine is not so pleasant. If you recall, Tziklag was completely burned, basically razed, so there wasn't much left to come home to. But the Hashkacha had it that he didn't need to stay here for too long, because he's about to learn that his enemy Shaul is now dead, and he's safe to come back and join the Jewish people and actually begin his kingship. Okay, but in any event, you see here the verse juxtaposing the death of Shaul with the return of David, the victorious return of David. Like we said earlier, as Shaul goes down, David ascends. And that's exactly what's happening here. And it was on the 3rd day, after David's return from a successful battle, that suddenly a man comes from the camp of Shaul. His garments are rent, right, torn. He has dirt on his head in a sign of mourning. And when he comes to David, he prostrates himself on the ground. David says, "Who are you? Where did you come from?" So he says, "I've escaped from the camp of the Jews." So David says to him, right? David doesn't know, right? We can assume that David thought they would be successful just like he was. David had tremendous success. He was able to come upon the entire Amaleki army. So David asks urgently, "Mehaya davar haged nali." tell me the news. What happened? And he said, the nation fled from war, and many fell and died, and also Shaul and his sons died. The verse is not necessarily quoting all the words that he said, but we see that there was a progression as he delivered the news. He said, first of all, we fled from the war, and there were casualties, and then ultimately, finally tells him about the death of Shaul and his sons. So I don't know how long it took him to give over the story, but it was a gradual buildup. As we know, when you share devastating news, you want to do it slowly, right? First, you say, like, he's not feeling so good, took a turn for the worse, and then you share the news. David said to this lad, how do you know? He wasn't convinced. Maybe you have bad information. How do you know that Shaul and Jonathan died? These are two significant characters in his life. His beloved friend Yehonatan and Shaul, his king. Vayomer Anar, and so the boy said, Nikro nikreti behar Gilboa. I happened to be around the mountain, and I saw Shaul leaning on his spear. And I saw that the enemy's armies were coming after him. And Shaul, while he was killing himself, he turned and saw me, and he called me, and I said, here I am at your service. And he asked me who I was, and I said to him, I am an Amaleki. This boy is speaking to David. So Shaul said to me, says the Amaleki, please kill me, because I am in the throes of death. Achazatni hashavatz. Hashavatz is a very unique word. In English, they translate it as the throes of death. There are other discussions about it, which I may mention. So please, he said, I'm near death. Please kill me. I'll just mention it quickly. Now that I mentioned that, I'll mention it. Hashavat could be referring to mishbetzet, which is the type of garment that the Kohanim wore. And Shaul was saying, he used this word to refer to the throes of death, because it also alludes to the garments of the Kohanim, because Shaul realized that he's being punished for wiping out the city of Kohanim. Yeah, so Shaul was, in a sense, accepting the justice of Hashem. So Shaul requested that this lad kill him. So the lad says to David, and so indeed I killed him, because I knew that he's not going to live. Like, I didn't murder him. I knew he wasn't going to survive. And so I killed him, and I took this crown from his head and the bracelet on his arm, and I bring them now to my master. So we have to know, as far as this Amaleki knew, he was telling David great news, not about the loss of the war, but about the death of his enemy. Shaul is your arch nemesis. He's been chasing you. You've had to live in Philistine land, and I brought you the crown. Right? Like, now this is yours for the taking, and I even brought you his bracelet. But the reaction of David is anything but gratitude and happiness. David grabs his garments and rips them, and also everybody that was with him. And they mourned and cried and fasted until the evening on the loss of Saul and Jonathan, and also on the loss of the Jewish people who fell in the war. So this is remarkable. The reaction of David is not to say, "Woof, what a relief! Now I can go back to my house. I can go back to my people. My life is not in danger anymore." He rends his garments, and he mourns over the loss of Shaul. And as we're going to see, he's going to punish this boy for even admitting to kill Shaul. There's a fascinating thing here. In the text, it says that he grabs his clothing, his garments, and he rips them. It's spelled bevigdo, his garment, singular, but we read it plural. The Radak says the reason it's read pluralized is because we learn from here a halacha that one must rend their garments like you do over, God forbid, a lost relative. We rend our garment by the heart. One must rend their garment for the loss of a Jewish king, also for the loss of an Av Beis Din, the head of the Sanhedrin, who was Jonathan in this case, and also if you hear about a loss of many Jews, there's an obligation to rend one's garments. And so here it was all three applied. It was Shaul, Jonathan, and the Jews that had fallen in war, as they specify. So he rent all three garments. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky asks, the truth is you require tearing for all three of those categories, but he didn't have to use multiple garments. He could have done it all on one garment, just make three different tears. We only rip all of our garments if, lo aleinu, a parent passes away. If one's mother or father passes away, you don't just rip the outer layer, you go until you expose the heart. And sometimes not literally, certainly not for women where that would be a lack of modesty, but we cut even the inner garments. And what we were learning from David here is that Shaul is first of all his father-in-law, so he's according him the same honor as a parent, tearing multiple layers. And also, perhaps the Gadol Hador, the leader of all the Jewish people, or the king, certainly has the status as a parent, and everybody would be required to tear multiple garments. These are discussions that happen here. But you see here, David is in true mourning. This is not just a lip service. He's truly feeling the pain of the loss of Shaul, the anointed one of God. Okay, let's wrap up with this final exchange. In verse number 13, Vayomer David el Anar Hamagidlo. Now David turns to the Alamaleki, and he says to him, "Who are you? Emi Zata, where are you from?" Not just like where have you come from. He's asking for his origins, his family origins. And he says to him, Ben Ish Ger Amaleki Anochi. I am the son of an Amaleki convert. And David says to him, how have you not feared to send your hand to harm the anointed one of God? What a chutzpah. You come proudly telling me that you put an end to Shaul's life? How do you not fear to do such a thing? David calls one of his lads, Vayomer Gash Pegabo. David orders his execution, and the Amaleki lad is executed. And David says to him, either before or once he's died, he says, Damchal Roshchecha, you're responsible for your own blood. Kificha ana b'cha lemor, because your own mouth has testified against you, saying that you killed the Mashiach Hashem. So you're responsible for your own death, for admitting to have harmed Shaul. Okay, there's a few issues here. Let's deal with them. Number one is, how do you put this together with the story that we just saw in the previous chapter? In the previous chapter, Shaul kills himself, and there's no mention of anybody helping from the outside. Here, the Amaleki is saying that he killed Shaul, or helped him commit suicide. So how do you put the two stories together? Two options. The first option is the Amaleki was actually lying. He was trying to win the favor of David, and he thought, what better news can I give him than the death of Shaul who's chasing him? And let me tell him that I was involved in the death, so I'll get rewarded by the future king. Okay, that obviously worked against him. But the first option is he was lying, and the original account of Shaul's death was the correct one. The second option is he's telling the truth. And what we read about earlier, that Shaul put his sword through himself, is true, but he wasn't successful in actually dying until he saw this lad passing by and he asked him to finish. And here we're getting the completion of the story. So this may or may not be an accurate reflection of the details. Number one. Number two is, how could David execute the Amaleki based on his own confession? Self-incrimination, right? Saying that you've done something wrong, we don't accept that in a Jewish court of law. It's called Ein Adam Mesim Atzmo Rasha. A person cannot make himself wicked. We don't accept testimony against oneself other than in financial matters. And this is certainly not a financial issue. So here David has accepted the testimony of the Amaleki against himself to put him to death. And it might not even be true. So, who is it? It's the Yamshel Shlomo again, or Shlomo Luria, I believe again, who said that this was an exceptional case. This was a Hora'as Shah. That it didn't matter that the Amaleki did or didn't. The fact that he was saying that he did was enough of a chutzpah, was enough of disrespect to the king, Shaul, and David said to preserve the dignity and the respect for royalty, I must put him to death. Furthermore, perhaps David needed to distance himself as much as possible from this episode, because he's about to take over the throne, and we know that Shaul had it out for David. Maybe David would be happy with his death, or maybe even assisted or something. So he had to make sure that everybody realized that he was not happy with the death of Shaul, and to preserve the integrity of the malchus, of the kingship, he had to put him to death. But in any event, this was a hora'at shad. This was not actually, he was not technically obligated in a court of law. It was David applying the kingly override of the rules, which you're allowed to do in special circumstances. Any question? No. Okay. The third question. So the question number one is, how did Shaul die? Was it with the Amaleki or not? It could be either way. Second question is, how are you allowed to put the Amaleki to death based on his own confession? The answer is, technically you can't, but a king has the right to override the regular rules in a time of need, and this was a time of need to preserve the integrity of the kingship. The third question is a very small side point. He says that he is the son of an Amaleki convert. Is Amalek allowed to convert? This is actually a discussion. It seems to be a machloket, a dispute between the Rambam and the Ravid. The halach is that we do accept Amaleki converts. There's a question if there's a restriction on them, like there is against the children of Edom, that they cannot marry into a regular Jewish family until 3 generations have passed. But this would seem to indicate that they are allowed to convert. This is one of the pieces of evidence. The other corner, you could say that they're not allowed to convert because we have a mitzvah to wipe them out. That's the discussion. I forgot. Right? We have a mitzvah to wipe them out. They're not allowed to convert them. In this case, the word ger means not convert, but somebody who dwells. I'm an Amaleki person that lives amongst you. My father moved to live amongst the Jews. He doesn't live with the Amalekis. He's a ger, a stranger in amongst the Jews. So it doesn't mean that he's literally Jewish. It just means that he's a resident amongst Jews. Yeah. That's an interesting discussion about whether Amalek can convert or not. Okay, and when we pick up next time, God willing, we'll learn about the lament, David's mournful dirge for Shaul, which is going to be beautiful and significant. All right, that's that. Mazel tov on the completion of half a book. Yeah, we've made it.
We made it.
Yeah.
We'll see you on